Everyday Samurai, Episode 2. Greetings, and welcome to Everyday Samurai, the podcast that is in service to individual liberty and securing a free state through the study of samurai martial systems, a victorious mindset, and the principles of political economy. That's right, we're all about personal empowerment and social contribution on this show, with the purpose of building a world that truly works for everyone through the disciplines of situational awareness, personal readiness, and expanded consciousness. Just how do we go about such lofty goals? We recognize that politics is always downstream of culture, so our task is to spread warrior virtues and the protector's ethic among a well-informed population of well-armed citizens. So get ready as we dive in once more to the groundbreaking book, Igensho, the Book of Dignity, General Principles of Martial Art. Remember, an outline of the book is available at no cost to you. All you have to do to get a free 21-page PDF download is sign up at www.everydaysamurai.life/dignity. That's www.everydaysamurai.life/dignity. Okay, let's welcome the author, Karasuma Kantaro, back to the show, or as we like to call him, Jim. Jim, how are you today?
Just fine, thank you. Good evening. How you doing?
Very well. Glad to have you with us.
Good to be here.
Last time we talked about the book, Igensho, and basically it's a distillation of several decades worth of personal journal notes that you had compiled and distilled for general consumption. And we talked about how you traveled from New York to live in Japan and to study both karate, and at some point you wound up in aikido and other samurai-related martial systems. But you talked a little bit about the purpose for writing the book, so maybe you can clarify that for the listeners.
Yes, sir. Well, the process began when I started teaching, and I hesitated to go out on my own. I was teaching for my teacher for a number of years under his direct supervision, and when I got home, we were separated by some thousands of miles, and he authorized me to teach on my own. At any rate, the process of teaching Americans who had either never been in Japan or in Asia, and many of whom had never done any kind of martial arts training before, involved trying to familiarize them with a number of concepts and facts which I felt were a necessary context to their physical activities. This ultimately involved a doomed attempt to teach a short course in East Asian culture and philosophy and religion in general, and most specifically Japanese history and culture and society and language, all of which are necessary elements of that context.
Let me interrupt just to remind the readers that, or the listeners, I should say, that you actually have a degree in Asian philosophy. So for most people that want martial arts training, they don't necessarily have that ground and foundation that you do, particularly with what you've studied before you went to Japan, but then also that highly immersive environment that you did train in.
My degree was not specifically in philosophy, but something that was called Asian Studies, which covered a fairly wide range of topics and which involved what they would call total cultural immersion. But in any case, I had long been a student of such elements of Asian philosophy as could be countered in translation in English, and that I ultimately learned my great cost was problematic, but I won't go into that just now. I began trying to put together some kind of coherent introductory contextual instruction for the new students who were about to begin their physical training, and I discovered that because I had no particular course structure, that I was lecturing or just discussing matters and answering questions, a kind of Socratic method of instruction, very casual and freewheeling, something on the order of what we're doing just now. And it would take several months. And with each new student, I had to start again and go through the same process, which was extremely inefficient, although it did provide me with a great mechanism of study for my own benefit, clarifying my own mind about a great many things, gradually reaching a far better understanding of the things that I was talking about. In any case, when I had accumulated enough trainees seemed to me that it was necessary to write a textbook so that rather than spend 2 or 3 months with each new student going over the same material, I could simply hand out the book and say, okay, read this, and any questions you have, by all means, bring them with you, and we'll try to answer or clarify these things.
Would you say then that the book was originally intended only for your student base, or did you write it with the idea that you were going to publish it?
No, it was intended just for my students, and later I hit on a sort of commercial idea, try to pick up a few dollars, I thought, by writing a short pamphlet, which could be sold very cheaply and which could be useful for people throughout the martial arts community in clarifying a number of fundamental principles that I believed were essential to all martial arts methods, to all athletics, to all elements of physical labor, the underlying elements of sensitivity and efficiency and body mechanics, which drive the human body in all of its various applied functions. In the process of collating and analyzing and integrating the notes, writing the book, teaching the students, a question which had been in my mind for many years began to seem possibly susceptible of being answered. I had in my mind the question, exactly what is martial art? How can it be defined so that we know quite literally what we're doing?
And the reasons behind it.
I had asked that question of a number of my various teachers, both stateside and in Japan, over a period of many years, and I'd never gotten a satisfactory answer, nor could I find anything useful in any dictionary or any existing, well, I can't say existing, I didn't read them all, but any text that I had encountered. And I began by approaching the problem by process of elimination, sort of using Occam's razor, as it were. Anybody that may not be familiar with that idea, the philosophic method of analysis. You examine all the likely or existing answers to a given question, and when you have eliminated everything that seems to be false or impossible, what you're left with must be true. So I try to apply that method to answering the question. And I begin at the beginning of the book by saying, I cannot say exactly what martial art is, but I do know what it is not. And so we began eliminating all the various elements of what I believe it is not. And by the time I had reached the end of the book, it was rewritten probably, 30 or 40 times. Long-term process, and a number of years. Finally was able to come out the tail end of it with what seems to me the only reasonably sound working definition that I've been able to find anywhere, which is to say that martial art consists in the systematic use of force in governance according to the laws of nature and the principles of philosophy, which indicates, among other things, that the only difference or differences between one martial art and another are cultural or philosophic ones.
Which leads us back to culture being upstream of politics, and that politics is always informed by the culture in which it finds itself.
Exactly. Now, one element which had led me into this whole inquiry was a line or a couple of lines that I had encountered many years earlier when I was still back in Japan in a text by Yagyu Tajima no Kami Munenori, the great strategist and swordsman of the 17th century, who was the personal instructor of first Tokugawa shogun Ieyasu, and who served in the capacity of what today we might call a national security advisor. And I cannot quote, and I don't remember what the text was.
Well, the book that I have from him is The Life-Giving Sword, because he talked about Katsujin no To and Satsujin no To, life-giving sword and the death-dealing sword.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I don't know if it was in that text or a different one, but he speaks about the dignified posture as being a key to the development of skill. And that got me thinking about a lot of things, and I came to realize that the alignment of the body, the relationship of the head and the spine and the center of gravity at the base of the spine to the limbs, the arms and legs, was all integrated in the process of ojigi, which is the bowing process, whether standing or seated on one's knees or seated on a chair or stool of some kind, that the integration of the body to function as one balanced, stable, mobile unit could be found within the physical composite of the bow. that led me into a further understanding of the metaphysical, social, political, cultural element of it, which is to say that the broad system of Chinese cosmology, which is manifest in all East Asian culture and martial art along with everything else, is largely based on the principles of yin and yo, or yin and yang, the negative and positive, male and female, dark and light, empty and full, all that stuff. And that the posture of the body with an erect spine demonstrates a condition of dignity, while lowering the head demonstrates a posture of humility. And that just like the yin-yo composite, there is an element of one in the other at all times, and they shift easily, efficiently, and constantly back and forth. You stand up straight or you sit up straight, you put your head down, you bring it back up, and you are embodying and demonstrating in that process the constant flow of negative and positive within your consciousness, within your physical action, and that this recruits the whole mechanical system of the body to operate in a way which is both sensitive and efficient. And that is the origin of all of the skill sets of East Asian martial arts, certainly, and ultimately of all physical activity.
Friends, if you are at all interested in Japan, the samurai, or Japanese martial arts of any kind, it is essential that you learn at least the basics of the language. That's right, you must study Japanese to have credibility in samurai-related martial arts. At least set a personal goal to learn the proper pronunciation for the terms in your art. Learn to say the names of the techniques correctly and be able to interact a little with the Japanese people you'll inevitably run into. Right now, there's no excuse, because when you sign up through my special link, you'll get a free 14-day trial to Rocket Languages. Just go to everydaysamurai.life/rocket to access interactive audio, culture notes, voice recognition technology to check your pronunciation, writing lessons so you can read the road signs or find a ramen shop when you need one. We're talking about 128 hours of lesson time and a downloadable app to take it all on the go with you. You can learn Japanese on your commute. It's never been easier. All this free for 2 full weeks when you go to www.everydaysamurai.life/rocket. That's everydaysamurai.life/rocket. Well, now that we have an understanding of what you mean by dignified postures in the martial arts and how the body mechanics align with the laws of nature, meaning the physical laws, then you extrapolate that, and I should say project it into not only the individual in terms of interpersonal conflict, but also as an individual within society and a culture that then generates a political environment and a system of governance. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about how the martial art and its ability to create dignity for the individual then fits into the social context.
Well, in the process of study and of research and inquiry and trying to express these things and organize them and put them on paper, I learned that etymology, I don't know if you call it a science, the practice of etymology, which is the analysis of words and their origins, is one of the most important mechanisms of inquiry that I've ever found. One can very often find a relatively efficient means or pathway to an answer about any question by analyzing the terms, particularly if they're standard terms, which are in use. Now, Confucius was asked by one of his students, what is the most important priority in ruling the state? Confucius answered by saying the first priority in running the state is the definition of terms. Now, originally, I read the Analects translated by James Legge in the late 19th century, which was a pioneering work, but very flawed in many respects. And his translation was something that he called the rectification of names. This is a very mysterious and esoteric sounding idea, and the florid language which was used by Legge in translating the ancient Chinese just surrounded it with a lot of cloud cover. It was like he was popping smoke around the subject. And it took me years to figure out, with the help of a friend of mine in Japan who is a great scholar of these subjects, far more than I, that what Confucius was talking about was the definition of terms, which is a standard operating procedure for all people involved in rational processes of communication and thought.
And isn't that interesting how it's coming back to haunt us in the sense that the definition of terms in the United States Constitution, when it was written, are now being stated as meaning something completely different, and not the least of which is the ability for people to do the mental gymnastics sufficient to say that the general welfare means now that your health care and your dental insurance gets taken care of on the tax dole.
Yeah, you can go through almost every word in the Constitution, and it's under dispute at some point in our history, and many of them remain so today. Terms like, well-regulated in the Second Amendment and so on. The definition of terms is the key to all human verbal transaction of any kind. Without getting into an extended discussion on that, just to say that philology or etymology became one of the most important tools for me in the process of trying to reason through these various questions. So looking at the term dignity in the Japanese language, I chose the term igen. There's also another one which is hin-i, meaning high class, characteristic of nobility and aristocracy in their deportment and ratiocination and so on. But igen is the one that struck me as being most relevant insofar as governance is the true function of martial art in any culture, in any society, in any form of government. Igen consists in two characters, two Chinese ideographs, which are read by the Japanese in several different ways, as many listeners may be aware, but others perhaps not. The Japanese use of Chinese characters involves always at least two readings. There's the so-called onyomi and kunyomi. The onyomi is the Japanese, the closest equivalency in sound that the Japanese can make in reading a Chinese character in its original form. Give a simple example. Take the word for water, which is omizu, but the Chinese reading is sui. And in Chinese, that's very close to the Chinese pronunciation of sui or se. So the Japanese reading is omizu, which is a word in the Japanese language pre-existing the use of Chinese characters. So there's always a Japanese reading and a Chinese reading for each of these things in the Japanese language. Igen, the word I, means in the Japanese language, it's the root of a verb iatsu suru, which means to intimidate or to overawe. And gen is the Chinese reading of a word which is read in Japanese, kibishi, which means precise, accurate, rigorous, harsh, exacting, severe, strict, or authoritarian. So you put these terms together, igen becomes a combination of power to intimidate, to enforce the will of the autocratic leader or of a government using military force as well as economic and other kinds of force. And strictness and severity and exactitude, these things taken together provide the idea of dignity, force and precision, which are applied ideally not only by the authority against subordinates, but also by the individual in a position of authority to himself.
In other words, the protection of their own lives, liberties, and property.
Well, now you're talking in Enlightenment terms, which are European and subsequently American terms. We're talking here about ancient times in a feudal society where there was no concept of individual rights. There was such a thing as private property, but it was determined by a legal system based fundamentally on arbitrary authority, based in power. So this is the fundamental difference between the American culture and that of pretty much all the rest of the world from ancient times up to the present. The ancient world and its various forms of tyranny did certainly in various cases provide for something that we would think of as being fairness or justice according to their way of seeing things. And of course, these are specifically differentiated among different cultures at different times, different classes of people, and so on. But the best way that I was able to organize the implications of these two terms, intimidation and power on the one hand, and precision and self-restraint and so on the other, was in a short list of characteristics: power, gravity, reason, compassion, and courage. Now, these are the things which are embodied in the bowing transaction, and they emerge in the structure of feudal societies, in this case a Confucian-based society, wherein you have, in Japan, 4 classes of people. The ruling class, which is the samurai class, the warrior, the hereditary warrior class of hereditary aristocrats under the emperor, who ostensibly, as in China, carries the mandate of heaven, which is something rather different in Asia than it is in Europe, where a similar concept was utilized to justify the power of kings and emperors and so forth. But that was the will of God, which was a Judeo-Christian concept quite alien to East Asia. But heaven would have embodied the entire cosmic system of the forces of nature, referred to in our language as the heavens, if you want to put it that way. The planets, the universe, the solar system, and of course the entire ecological system of our planet. All the laws and forces of nature, some of which are known and most of which probably are not, even now. The Chinese system, which spread throughout East Asia, was an attempt to organize this knowledge and to apply it for practical purposes without benefit of scientific method, which is quite a remarkable undertaking. And that gives us the entire system of Chinese cosmology, which is at the basis of everything in East Asian life, from religion to politics to law to engineering to medicine to martial art to literature, art, and whatever else you can think of.
Then let's tie this back to the current era, where people reading this book and studying martial arts that might have the question of what does it mean in the larger context of how we apply our training and the lineages and the information that have been passed down through generations of martial heritage to us in the modern world, can take this and transform our understanding of martial art as being quote-unquote self-defense into the larger context of it being about preserving dignity of the individual in a society that values the individual.
Well, it took me in stage one, the whole book, to try to identify that problem and begin to address it. And since publishing that book, I've been working on another one, which is now about 2,000 pages in manuscript, trying to deal a little better with many of the implications of that question.
Well, it can't be too far from your foreword, because you even talk about this as being an identification and a codex of principles that then leads to the system of government. And you alluded to it earlier, that it is not only for government of societies, but government of individuals.
Yeah, and that also goes back to ancient times, because in order to maintain good order in society, everyone had a place, and everyone had to know his place and function accordingly, so that the process of training and education for people of different classes of society, by the way, I started to define those in Japan. So you had the ruling class, you had the class of artisans and craftsmen and people that produced all the goods and services of society. You had the class of people that dealt with banking and credit and exchange, and you had the class of so-called untouchables, which is a very large and complex social and political issue I won't try to go into just now, but those were the people at the bottom of the totem pole who had virtually no rights at all under the law.
Yeah, you make mention of the untouchables when in fact they didn't even register as a class.
Well, their class was artificially created by the ruling class because...
As are all classes.
Well, yes and no. There is a spontaneous emergence of classes through the division of labor in various different societies and through the development of specialization and all that sort of thing, which is, an economic phenomenon. But you had the ruling class and the class of, I beg your pardon, farmers, the people that produced all the food, and then the class of artisans and producers of structures and implements, and the business class, which under feudalism was considered to be the very lowest social class, because as is the case with communist ideology, people who deal in money and credit transactions are thought of as parasites, because they don't produce anything that you can eat or anything that you can sit on or anything that you can kill with. They just move paper around or metal around from one person to another, and they take a profit in the process, so that feudal thinkers and communist thinkers who are, in some respects, quite the same, believe that these people are unproductive and yet they are profiting from the productivity of other people, that they are therefore parasites, which is complete nonsense.
Let me jump in a second to tell you about shop.everydaysamurai.life. If you're interested in personal security and readiness, you've probably got some tools that go into your everyday carry. Hopefully, this includes a tactical pen, because when you're legislatively or otherwise situationally unable to carry the best tools for the job, your last resort might just be a tactical pen. Having the right one could just be the deciding factor in a crisis. That's shop.everydaysamurai.life. We've got an assortment of tactical pens ideally suited for strength and power when you need it most. The samurai of old followed what is known in Japanese as bunbu ryodo, sword and brush, or the dual path of scholarly and martial arts. A tactical pen means you've always got options. Plus, we're putting the finishing touches on a basic employment guide that will be yours as a bonus, absolutely free, when you purchase any EDC pen from our site. So check out shop.everydaysamurai.life today. Pick up a tactical pen, a first aid kit, or even some samurai-themed accessories. That's shop.everydaysamurai.life.
Now, the Japanese government, the shogunate, knew very well that without the proper functions of economics and business, that there was nothing. All of society would collapse and be reduced to penury and a kind of Neolithic age existence.
Yeah, but that didn't prevent them from actually outlawing international trade and closing the country off from the International Division of Labor.
For them, knowing on the one hand that they depended for their power and for their ability to govern upon money and business, and at the same time proscribing business people and bankers and so on as being parasitic persons of very little virtue or value, they had a quandary that they had to deal with. If they kept the business people at the low end of the social ladder and accorded them no status and no respect, then they could not expect these people to be useful and productive for them. So they created a lower class, the lowest class of so-called untouchables, who were largely defined according to principles of Buddhism, people who ate meat and dealt in butchering animals and producing leather goods from hides and a whole range of other things that had to do with touching blood, which was considered to be unclean in the Shinto religion, and eating meat, which was considered to be an extremely low and contemptible practice among the Buddhists. They therefore define these people as being equivalent to the untouchables of India, which was the origin of Buddhism, so that the businessmen and bankers could have someone to look down on and to consider themselves superior to, so that they would identify themselves with the people above them rather than those below.
That being said, let's tie this back to the modern era, where classes have been abolished, and normally classes don't survive without a legal enforcement mechanism. And in today's society, the average martial arts practitioner is both merchant, consumer, and warrior, and especially in the American context, where every citizen is, in theory at least, a member of the militia. So how does the martial arts practitioner take what they do in the dojo, on the range, in their training, and then put that into a meaningful context for society and upholding dignity for themselves and in the larger social context?
Okay, so we began by looking at what the term Igen means in the Japanese language. Eventually, I came to realize that, well, I didn't realize this because it's very difficult when you're dealing with dictionaries and translations and equivalent meanings and so on to ensure accuracy. One starts out with the idea, okay, you look in the dictionary, say dignity, and you come up with Igen or hinyi or whatever other term may arise. And there's an equivalency there, so you just assume that the two words mean the same thing, but in so many cases this is far from true. So in feudal societies, the Japanese in particular here, but one can see that in virtually all feudal societies, that the Japanese term can be applied meaningfully to whatever language is used in some other feudal society. Status, social status, confers dignity, and power confers social status, and ultimately that always devolves down to the power to kill people and break things. If you look at the Latin root of the term dignity, it is dignitas, which in ancient times referred to that which is of highest value. Now, that leaves the subject open. Whatever is of highest value or is generally agreed to be such in any given society, in any class of people, in any time and place, can confer dignity. That will take us off in a number of different directions. But when we look at American society, which is founded upon a number of principles that our founders derived from their studies of ancient Greek and Roman and Hebrew literature and of the later doctrines of Christianity, all of which led to the European Enlightenment of, let's say, the late 17th through the mid-19th centuries. There are a number of elements which are not common to the East Asian model or to many of the international models of hierarchy and authority and power and social structure in different countries. What our founders took from the Europeans, people like David Hume and John Locke and Adam Smith and so on, was the idea of the sovereignty of the individual human being. Now, that can go off, again, in a number of different directions, but if we reduce it to a single concept, the most quintessential concept of American culture and philosophy, or I should say philosophy and culture, because uniquely in the United States, culture does not produce philosophy, but rather philosophy produces culture. This is the only country in the history of the world that I'm aware of that was conceived and designed and founded by philosophers for the purpose of doing justice.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Everyday Samurai and look forward to seeing you next time. Be sure to subscribe to our feed so you don't miss an episode. If you like what you've heard here, give us a thumbs up or a 5-star review. Remember, the free PDF outline of Igensho, the Book of Dignity, is available free at www.everydaysamurai.life/dignity. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and be well.